our last speaker is Emma Llansó. Emma Llansó, you are graduate from your Yale Law School, and you joined the Center for Democracy and Technology. So you are the director of the Center's Freedom of Expression project. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, and thank you to our hosts for the opportunity to speak with you all today. My name is Emma Llansó, and I'm from the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is a nonprofit public interest advocacy organization that seeks to promote human rights in internet policy. While many important issues have been raised today, and I particularly would like to support the Special Rapporteur's comments on the importance of encryption to security and freedom of expression online, I wanted to focus my comments today on highlighting the risks to privacy and freedom of expression from efforts to push regulation of online terrorist activity onto private companies. In recent weeks and months, there have been calls from political leaders around the world for internet companies to do more to combat the spread of radical ideologies online. Government officials have emphasized a desire for public-private partnerships, establishing initiatives and even calling on companies to change their terms of service, all seemingly aimed at the goal of seeing companies restrict more content online. In developing approaches to responding to terrorist propaganda, it's vital that we all do so from within the framework of essential protections from fundamental human rights that was laid out for us earlier. A good example of this sort of program that raises some challenges, that highlights the risks and challenges raised by efforts to leverage private companies' enforcement mechanisms for content removal, are what are called Internet Referral Unit programs that are already underway in a number of states. These are programs by which law enforcement officers flag content that they wish to see removed from the web for review under a website's terms of service rather than pursuing formal legal action against the speech. This type of program raises a number of challenges under the human rights framework. A key fact to recall is that companies' privately developed terms of service and content policies are typically more restrictive and often much more restrictive than what governments may permissibly restrict under law. Further, these programs may not always be clearly articulated in law. The specific procedures and processes are often not communicated transparently with the public, and there has not been an evidence-based showing that they are necessary or effective. Typically, these programs do not provide a clear definition of prescribed content. As many speakers have said already today, there is no internationally agreed upon definition of extremist content. This results in delegation of setting those definitions to private actors. Under these programs, government officials seek content restriction with no review by a judge or under other independent authority, creating a circumvention of due process protections for freedom of expression. And thus, individuals whose speech or access to information are affected by these programs have no opportunity for redress. They have no access to a remedy or an opportunity to appeal these decisions, either with the government or often with the company. So this sort of program helps to demonstrate that there is a need for transparency and greater clarity from governments about their efforts to see content removed from the internet. Governments have the obligation under international human rights law to ensure that policies are articulated in law, are based in evidence, as my colleague Judith has discussed, that they are likely to achieve the compelling goal or interest of the state. Governments must provide a clear, understandable definition of what content or speech is to be restricted, and policy development processes should be open and participatory. Further, we see a real need for greater transparency from companies about how their content removal processes actually work. Very little information is available publicly about the scope and scale of content removal efforts of major internet companies, though we know that it happens every day and involves significant time and resource expenditure on their part. If policymakers are engaging companies in discussions of their roles in responding to terrorist propaganda, even on a voluntary or public-private partnership basis, we all, as interested and affected stakeholders, need to be able to discuss and evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches. Because, it must be said, no company has a perfect record on content removal, even according to their own terms of service. All companies' review and moderation processes will be vulnerable to error. This is simply inevitable at the scale at which they operate. And policymakers must understand that there are a variety of types of content filtering with their own strengths and weaknesses, including automated processes where content is filtered based on keywords, other automated processes such as YouTube's Content ID or Microsoft's Photo DNA, where images or sound files are identified for removal based on comparison to a reference database of previously identified material. Most content moderation processes also involve some subjective assessment through human review of flagged content, a time-consuming and labor-intensive process. But regardless of the type of content removal process, there are potentials for error. On the one hand, because no filter is perfect, content that could or should be removed under terms of service may be missed and not removed. Now, if companies face potential legal sanction for failure to remove content, this type of potential error leads to overblocking of protected speech. This risk is why we have seen the wide recognition of the importance of legal protections from intermediary liability to freedom of expression online, including reports by the previous Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and UNESCO's Internet study from earlier this year. On the other hand, errors may be false positives, where content that does not violate terms of service, much less violate the law, is also removed. And here key questions have to be, what are the remedies for speakers who have been silenced? What else happens to a speaker and her personal information if she is erroneously identified as having expressed or been associated with online terrorist activity? So in conclusion, I'll just say that ultimately, vague, overbroad policies in this arena that shift too much responsibility onto private companies and remove procedural protections for fundamental rights create the risk of overbroad censorship and removal of lawful protected speech from the internet. We may also see results that are counterproductive to national security, and particularly anti-radicalization efforts, if people from certain ethnic groups, nationalities, or religions are targeted, either intentionally or inadvertently through algorithmic processes, for greater scrutiny and censorship. Finally, overzealous efforts to pursue expedited, privatized content removal risk undermining the rule of law and the values of a democratic society. As we will be discussing later today, efforts in this arena really should focus on supporting opportunities for counter-speech, but any policy aimed at seeking the removal of content from the internet should be developed in an open, transparent, participatory process and should be based on evidence of efficacy as well as informed by technical and practical capabilities in order to ensure that human rights and fundamental freedoms are protected and respected. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. I think that further to Judith, you did call us to have a multi-stakeholders approach and to have a balanced approach between public and private sector.